The wind came down from the northern ridge in gusts that bent the pines and rattled the cabin windows, carrying with it the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen, but would by nightfall. It was October 2003, and the mountains of Montana's Bob Marshall wilderness wore the muted colors of late autumn, gold and rust bleeding into gray granite. 23-year-old Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the trailhead parking lot, adjusting the straps on his pack one final time, while his younger brother Jason argued with him about cell phone reception, both of them laughing because they knew there wouldn't be any for the next 4 days. Marcus was an experienced backpacker, methodical and prepared, the kind of person who triple-checked his topographic maps and always carried extra paracord. He kissed his girlfriend Sarah goodbye, promised his parents he'd call from the ranger station when he got back, and started up the trail alone, boots crunching over frost-stiffened leaves. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, he had gained 800 feet of elevation, and the parking lot had become a memory below him, swallowed by forest. Nobody who saw him that morning could have imagined that Marcus Webb would not return in 4 days, or 4 months, or 4 years, and that when his voice finally emerged from silence over a decade later, it would come from a place that wasn't supposed to exist on any map. The first 48 hours passed normally because nobody expected him back. But when Tuesday became Wednesday, and then Thursday, and the ranger station confirmed that Marcus had never checked in, Sarah drove to his parents' house in Kalispell with her hands shaking on the wheel. They called the county sheriff, who activated the search and rescue coordinator by Friday morning. Within 6 hours, 12 volunteers from the local SAR unit were staging at the trailhead, organizing into teams with radios and GPS units, while a helicopter from Glacier National Park waited for the fog to lift. Marcus's planned route covered 32 miles in a rough loop, following the South Fork drainage up to Chinese Wall and back through the high basins, terrain he'd hiked twice before. The dogs picked up his scent immediately, following it 4 miles up the trail to a tributary crossing, where the tracks became confused, circling the same 100-yard radius as if Marcus had spent time there deciding something. One handler noted in her report that the pattern suggested deliberation, not distress. They found his first campsite on day 3 of the search, a flat spot beside the creek with stones arranged in a fire ring, pine needles compressed where his tent had stood, and a single piece of evidence that changed everything. A page torn from his journal, weighted down with a rock, containing 8 words in his handwriting. Saw something. Following higher, back by dark. The entry was dated October 12th, the 2nd day of his trip, but there was no indication of what he'd seen or which direction higher meant, and darkness had come and gone for 72 hours since then. The search expanded to a 3-mile radius, teams sweeping the avalanche chutes and boulder fields, while technical climbers checked the cliff bands for falls. His parents arrived at the command post and sat in folding chairs outside the incident tent, drinking coffee that went cold in their hands, while radios crackled with negative reports. By the end of week 1, the probability of live recovery had dropped below 40% according to the statistical models, and by week 2, the organized search transitioned to limited continuous mode, which meant smaller teams on weekends and no more helicopters. The years that followed taught the Webb family a specific kind of endurance that had no name. Marcus's father, Richard, quit his job as an accountant and trained as a wilderness EMT, spending every summer volunteering with search and rescue units across 3 states, as if saving other people's children could somehow reach backward through time. His mother, Linda, became an advocate for missing persons databases, learning the bureaucratic architecture of NamUs and NCIC, attending conferences where she met other parents whose eyes carried the same exhausted vigilance. Sarah finished her degree in environmental science and took a job with the Forest Service, not because she'd moved on, but because being in the mountains felt like being close to the question that had no answer. Jason grew from 17 to 28. got married, had a daughter he named Emma, and sometimes caught himself looking at the wilderness photos in Marcus's old albums, wondering if his brother had become something else out there, something adapted to survival in ways that regular life couldn't accommodate. Every October they held a vigil at the trailhead, fewer people each year, until it was mostly just family and a couple of old SAR volunteers who remembered. The evidence never multiplied. In 2005, a hiker found a scrap of blue fabric on a branch 7 miles northeast of Marcus's last known position, but the lab analysis was inconclusive. In 2008, a wildfire burned through 12,000 acres of the search area, and Richard walked the ash fields afterward with a map, hoping the flames might have revealed something, but they hadn't. The journal page remained the last communication. Those 8 words, analyzed by handwriting experts and behavioral psychologists, who concluded only that Marcus had made a deliberate choice to deviate from his planned route, suggesting agency rather than accident. What he'd seen was never determined. Wildlife, possibly. An unusual geological formation, or something personal that only made sense inside his own decision tree. The wilderness kept its secrets with the same indifference it kept everything else, and after a while, the not knowing became a permanent condition, something the family learned to carry the way you carry old injuries that ache when weather changes. If you've ever wondered how people survive when every logical timeline says they shouldn't, you'll want to stay with this story, because what happens next challenges everything we think we understand about human endurance and the elasticity of identity. November 2014, 11 years, 1 month and 6 days after Marcus Webb walked into the Bob Marshall wilderness. The phone call came to Linda Webb's landline at 9:15 on a Tuesday night, and she almost didn't answer because unknown numbers usually meant telemarketers or political surveys. But something made her pick up. Maybe the same instinct that had kept her paying for Marcus's cell phone service all those years, even though it had been disconnected since 2004. The voice on the other end was male, rough, hesitant, with strange pauses between words as if speech itself required translation from some other mode of communication. "Mom," it said. Just that. And then, "It's Marcus. I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain." Linda's legs stopped working, and she sat down on the kitchen floor, still holding the phone, making a sound that brought Richard running from the garage. The voice continued, giving details no stranger could know, childhood memories and private jokes, and the specific way he used to call their old dog. And then it gave a location. Coordinates read slowly from what he said was a ranger's GPS unit, somewhere in the northwestern corner of the Flathead National Forest, 43 miles from where he'd disappeared. The authorities needed confirmation protocols. Richard drove through the night with Jason, meeting a sheriff's deputy and 2 SAR coordinators at a staging area near the coordinates, then hiking in by headlamp over terrain that barely qualified as trail. They found him 2 hours before dawn, sitting outside a fire lookout tower that hadn't been manned since the 90s, wrapped in a salvaged emergency blanket that was so faded it was more white than silver. The man who stood when he saw their lights looked like Marcus, in the same way a tree ring looks like the sapling it used to be. All the essential architecture there, but weathered into something harder and stranger. He was lean to the point of gaunt, his hair long and tied back with what looked like braided grass, his hands scarred in patterns that suggested specific repeated tasks, and his eyes carried a wariness that didn't fade even when Richard embraced him. "He didn't think anyone would still be looking," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the last word. The deputy called it in while Jason just stood there crying, and by the time the sun rose they were walking back down, Marcus moving with the efficiency that spoke of thousands of miles traveled on foot, stopping occasionally to touch trees or rocks as if saying goodbye to something. The medical evaluation at Kalispell Regional took 11 hours. Marcus was dehydrated and showed signs of chronic malnutrition, but his vital signs were stable and he had no acute injuries, which was almost more unsettling than if he'd been broken in obvious ways. His teeth showed unusual wear patterns consistent with a diet lacking modern softness. He had scars from injuries that had healed without medical intervention, including what looked like a badly set fracture in his left hand from years prior. The psychological assessment noted dissociative symptoms and difficulty with linear time concepts, but he was oriented to person and eventually to place, though he kept asking what year it was, as if the answer might change. The FBI got involved because a disappearance of this duration with a live recovery triggered protocols about possibility of abduction or coercion. But Marcus insisted he'd been alone the entire time, that no crime had occurred except his own failure to find his way back. "I kept trying," he told the investigator, his hands twisting together in his lap. "Every year I tried, but the distances got confused and I'd end up somewhere different than I intended, and after a while I stopped trusting my sense of direction enough to risk a final push." The story he told over the following weeks emerged in fragments, non-linear. Each session with the trauma counselor or the debriefing specialists adding another piece that didn't quite fit the puzzle anyone expected. He'd seen what he thought was smoke from a camp that second day, something that seemed wrong for the elevation and season, and he'd climbed higher to investigate, leaving the marked trail in a decision that lasted maybe 15 minutes, but changed the trajectory of his entire life. The smoke turned out to be mist rising from a thermal spring he'd never seen marked on any map, and by the time he'd documented it in his journal and turned to descend, a weather front had moved in with the speed that only happens in mountain country, dropping visibility to arm's length and erasing his tracks in fresh snow. He'd tried to navigate by compass, but the terrain was complex, full of drainages that looked similar and ridges that seemed to lead back toward the trail, but actually curved away into unmapped basins. He spent the first night in a natural rock shelter, rationing his food and assuming rescue would come within days. But the storm lasted 70 hours, and when it cleared, he was in a drainage system he didn't recognize, with his map useless because he couldn't determine his starting point for any triangulation. The details of 11 years lived in wilderness came slowly, rationed by Marcus's own capacity to articulate them. He described the first winter as pure survival, finding caves and building debris shelters, learning to trap small game with snares made from his bootlaces and later from braided plant fibers, filtering water through charcoal he made from controlled burns. He talked about the psychological shift that happened around month 4, when he stopped thinking of himself as lost and started thinking of himself as living in a specific place that simply wasn't connected to the place he'd come from. He mentioned finding the abandoned fire lookout in year 2, its supplies long expired, but the structure itself intact enough to provide shelter, and how he'd used the panoramic view to slowly map the territory he'd come to know, marking drainages and ridges and game trails on paper he made from birch bark pounded flat. The journals he'd kept filled 17 handmade books, now spread across a conference table at the Forest Service office, their pages covered in handwriting that evolved from his original neat script into something more compact and efficient, interspersed with sketches of plants and animals and topographic features, along with tally marks counting days and moons and the migration patterns of elk herds. The question everyone asked was why he hadn't been found, and the answer was geography combined with cognitive drift. The area where he'd established his range was in a section of wilderness that had been searched in the first weeks, but he'd been mobile then, fleeing the helicopter sounds because they terrified him in his disoriented state, associating them with the storm's chaos. By the time he'd stabilized and might have welcomed rescue, the search had contracted to the area near his last known position, and he was by then 15 linear miles away across terrain that funneled search patterns in different directions. He'd seen search planes twice in the early years and had tried to signal them, but the forest canopy was dense and his attempts at smoke signals had been too dispersed to register. After year 5, he admitted, he'd stopped trying actively, not because he wanted to stay, but because the psychological cost of hope, followed by disappointment, had become unsustainable. He'd developed a routine that kept him alive, food sources that cycled with seasons, shelter strategies for different weather, and a mental framework that made each day navigable even if the larger context of his life had become fractured beyond recognition. Right here, as you're processing the impossibility of this survival, you're probably asking yourself the same question the investigators asked. What does it do to a human mind to be that isolated for that long? And can someone who's crossed that boundary ever really come back? The reintegration was not a movie reunion. Linda and Richard brought Marcus home to a house he recognized but couldn't quite inhabit, where light switches and refrigerator hum, and the simple act of sitting in a room with walls felt subtly wrong. He slept on the floor for the first month because beds were too soft, too enclosed. He couldn't tolerate television or radio, the sensory input fragmenting his concentration into shards. Conversations exhausted him because his verbal processing had slowed, the neural pathways for language having been pruned by years of internal monologue that didn't require words. Sarah came to visit, and they sat together on the porch, not speaking. And after an hour, she started crying because the person beside her was and wasn't the person she'd loved, and Marcus couldn't comfort her because he didn't fully remember how comfort worked in the context of other people. Jason brought Emma, now 3 years old, and Marcus watched her with fascination and something like grief, realizing he'd missed not just his own life, but the multiplication of life around him, all the births and marriages and graduations that had continued in his absence. The physical evidence from his journals became the subject of academic study. Wilderness survival experts analyzed his accounts of food preservation, shelter engineering, and seasonal navigation, finding them consistent with known techniques, but applied with an iterative sophistication that suggested genuine long-term adaptation. Botanists identified the plants he'd documented, including several medicinal applications he'd discovered through trial and error that aligned with traditional indigenous knowledge from the region. Psychologists studied his writing for signs of psychosis or personality disintegration and found instead a kind of enforced minimalism, his sense of self reduced to its functional core and then slowly rebuilt around the requirements of daily survival. One researcher described it as enforced mindfulness at a scale that would destroy most people, noting that Marcus's continued sanity was less miraculous than it was evidence of extreme cognitive flexibility. The journals also contained something unexpected: detailed observations of wildlife behavior, weather patterns, and ecological relationships documented with such care that they filled gaps in scientific understanding of that particular ecosystem, making Marcus an accidental citizen scientist whose data set covered 11 continuous years in an area rarely observed. The legal questions were complex. Marcus had been declared legally dead in 2011 after the standard 7-year period, which meant his existence now created bureaucratic paradoxes. His social security number was inactive. His driver's license had expired and couldn't simply be renewed because there was no category for returned from presumed death. His college degree still existed, but the student loan deferrals granted to deceased borrowers now reverted to active status, along with accumulated interest. The small life insurance policy Linda had taken out years before had paid out to his designated beneficiary, creating an obligation that no one knew how to resolve. A lawyer who specialized in unusual cases worked pro bono to untangle it all, filing motions in 3 different jurisdictions, and the process took 14 months to restore Marcus to legal personhood, a phrase that struck everyone involved as grimly appropriate. The media attention was inevitable and overwhelming. The story hit national news within 48 hours of confirmation, framed as a miracle survival narrative that news outlets loved because it offered hope in a landscape usually defined by loss. But the family quickly learned that attention and understanding were different things. Reporters wanted the story to fit templates they recognized, either the heroic survivor who conquered nature through willpower or the damaged victim who needed rescue from his own choices. Marcus was neither. He'd simply continued existing day after day because stopping wasn't a real option, and the fact that this had taken 11 years was more about geographic misfortune and systems failure than it was about extraordinary individual qualities. The family stopped giving interviews after a producer suggested they'd be perfect for a reality show about wilderness survival, as if Marcus's experience was content rather than trauma. What finally brought the national conversation to something productive was Marcus's decision, 18 months after his return, to partner with wilderness advocacy organizations to improve search and rescue protocols. He testified before a congressional subcommittee about the gaps in search coverage, the lack of standardized debriefing processes for family members, and the need for better training in extended duration searches that accounted for the possibility of displaced survivors rather than static victims. His journals became training materials, teaching SR teams how to think about lost person behavior over time frames measured in years rather than days. He worked with GPS technology companies to develop better emergency beacon systems with longer battery life and more reliable satellite communication. And he consulted with wilderness therapy programs about the psychological resilience factors that had allowed him to maintain mental coherence in isolation. The work gave him purpose and reconnected him to humanity through a door he could navigate, one that drew on his experience without requiring him to perform emotion he didn't authentically feel. The question of what Marcus had originally seen, the smoke or mist that had drawn him off trail, was never satisfactorily answered. Thermal features in that region were known, but not comprehensively mapped, and when a geological survey team visited the coordinates from his journal, they found evidence of intermittent geothermal activity that might produce steam under certain temperature conditions, visible from a distance, but dissipating quickly enough to leave no permanent trace. It was, in the end, nothing supernatural or even particularly unusual, just a natural phenomenon in the wrong place at the wrong time, observed by someone who made a reasonable decision that happened to have catastrophic consequences. Marcus seemed almost relieved by the mundanity of it, as if a dramatic explanation would have cheapened the weight of what he'd endured. By 2017, 3 years after his return, Marcus had achieved a kind of equilibrium that didn't look like his old life, but was recognizably a life nonetheless. He lived in a small cabin he'd built himself on land his parents owned, close enough to visit, but separate enough to manage the sensory environment. He worked remotely as a consultant for wilderness organizations, writing reports and training materials that drew on his unique expertise. He'd reconnected with Sarah not as romantic partners, but as friends who shared history, and she sometimes brought her new family to visit, her husband and 2 kids who Marcus taught to identify plants and read weather patterns. He spoke at SAR conferences and missing persons advocacy events, his presentations quiet and technical, focused on systems improvement rather than personal narrative. He didn't consider himself a survivor in the heroic sense that word usually implied, more someone who'd been shunted into a parallel track of existence and then found his way back to a junction point, changed in ways that were permanent but not necessarily tragic. The long-term psychological studies documented something unexpected. While Marcus showed markers of trauma and adjustment disorder, he also demonstrated measurable increases in certain cognitive capabilities, particularly spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and emotional regulation under stress. His time in wilderness had functioned as a kind of extreme training regimen, pruning away mental processes that weren't survival critical and strengthening those that were. Researchers debated whether this constituted damage or adaptation, and the answer seemed to be both simultaneously, the brain reshaping itself to meet environmental demands in ways that left permanent marks. Marcus described it once as feeling like he'd learned a second language of existence, one that didn't have direct translation back to the primary language, but informed everything he thought and did in subtle ways. "I'm bilingual now," he said, "but one of my languages doesn't have any other speakers." The Webb family established a foundation in 2018 focused on extended duration missing persons cases, providing resources for families navigating the specific hell of ambiguous loss and funding research into improved search methodologies. Linda ran it with the same methodical attention she'd applied to Marcus's search, building a network of support groups and advocacy initiatives. Richard continued his SAR work, now bringing Marcus's story to training sessions as a case study in the importance of expanding search parameters and questioning assumptions about survivability. Jason took Emma hiking in the same mountains where his brother had disappeared, teaching her wilderness skills and making sure she understood that the wilderness wasn't malevolent, just indifferent, and that respect rather than fear was the appropriate response. They all carried Marcus's experience differently, each finding their own way to integrate it into a coherent narrative that allowed forward motion. In the fall of 2019, Marcus returned to the Bob Marshall Wilderness for the first time since his recovery, accompanying a SAR training exercise as an observer. He stood at the same trailhead where he'd begun his hike 16 years earlier, the parking lot unchanged except for a small memorial plaque listing names of people who'd gone missing in the wilderness, his own name now marked with an asterisk and the word "found." He hiked with the team to his original last known position, the creek crossing where the search dogs had circled in confusion, and stood there for a long time, looking up toward the higher elevations. Someone asked if he wanted to continue to where the thermal spring had been, to close the loop on the geography of his ordeal, but he shook his head. "I already know what's up there," he said, "and it doesn't need me to return to it." And on the hike back down, he pointed out things the instructors missed, animal signs and weather indicators and micro-terrain features, his knowledge of the landscape still perfect and strange, a library of information encoded during years when staying alive depended on reading every detail correctly. The wind comes down from the northern ridge in gusts that bend the pines and rattle the cabin windows, carrying with it the scent of snow that hasn't fallen yet, but will by nightfall. Marcus sits on his porch, watching the tree line, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, and sometimes he imagines parallel versions of his life. The one where he didn't climb toward the thermal spring, where he stayed on trail and finished the loop and drove home to Sarah and a future that unfolded conventionally. But those versions are ghosts of probability, and this version is what exists, with all its scars and adaptations and strange gifts. He is 40 years old now, and he has lived two distinct lives in one body, and the seam between them is visible but no longer bleeding. The mountains are still there on the horizon, indifferent and immense, keeping their secrets with the patience of geological time. And Marcus Webb, who disappeared into them and emerged transformed, has made his peace with being both the person who was lost and the person who was found, understanding finally that sometimes those are not the same thing at all, and that survival means accepting the distance between them without demanding it collapse into simple resolution.